Hello, everybody. I hope that you hear me well. Depending on your whereabouts, I wish you a very good afternoon, a very good morning, or a very good evening. My name is Oleg Kirica, and I'm the head of the Global Initiatives Program at the International Center for Migration Policy Development, or ICMPD. Before we start, I would like to stress that there is interpretation available in French and Spanish. You can choose the language of your preference in the section Interpretation displayed on the bottom right-hand side of the Zoom menu panel. On behalf of ICMPD, I have the pleasure to warmly welcome you all to the Zoom Out Diaspora Engagement Globally online event. We express our gratitude to all of you for joining us today. As you may know, ICMPD is an international intergovernmental organization applying a three-pronged approach to its activities: policy and research, migration dialogue, and capacity building. ICMPD has been working in all areas of migration, including on diaspora engagement, the topic of our today's webinar. Our diaspora portfolio spans over a decade, and we have actively been collaborating with governments and diaspora organizations alike. I remember very vividly that 7 or 8 years ago, we started receiving an increasing number of requests from diverse governments all over the world, willing to cooperate with us on diaspora matters, such as development of diaspora engagement policy frameworks, strategies, establishment of new institutions, or capacity building, to name just a few. This proliferation of requests explains a trend which, according to many observers, coincided with the efforts of the Global Forum on Migration and Development to put diaspora matters on the global agenda, and which forged a much needed space to discuss and debate the role of diasporas in development and the measures that governments may take to implement meaningful engagement. This upsurge of requests also attests to the fact that it was about 8 or 9 years ago that an increasing number of governments started establishing institutions and policies on diaspora engagement and intensified their efforts to reach out to their citizens or descendants residing abroad. This trend continues today. According to some scholars, more than 120 out of 193 United Nations member states have in place at least one diaspora institution. Indeed, there has been an impressive rise of diaspora agencies at governmental level, with a remarkable increase between 2000 and 2015, but also significant moves among diaspora members when it comes to associating themselves and creating well-established platforms and networks. It is fascinating to see where we stand today in terms of diversity of actors, dedicated institutions, policies, strategies, initiatives, even energies, and advocacy linked to diaspora engagement. It is against this backdrop that the EU Global Diaspora Facility, fully funded by the European Commission Directorate General for International Cooperation and Development and implemented by ICMPD, was established in June 2019. We have recently turned 1 year old, and to celebrate this milestone, we wanted to share with you some key findings from a recently finished truly global research exercise that covers 50 countries situated on 5 continents and that analyzes the institutions, policies, and initiatives that governments opted for in order to launch or to advance their cooperation with diasporas. Our research efforts do not stop here, and we will conduct more analysis covering other 50 countries in the course of the next months. Indeed, our intention is, through research, to take the pulse, so to speak, of the most recent developments globally in order to better understand the current context, to contribute to the global debate on diaspora engagement, and to inform our next activities, which will provide capacity development to governments and diaspora groups, where we'll support our diaspora experts mobilization scheme to be launched very soon. So please stay tuned. In essence, the EU Global Diaspora Facility revolves around 4 interconnected components: research and knowledge, capacity development, dialogues and partnership, as well as mobilization of diaspora experts for development. For more details, please do visit our webpage that we launched a couple of weeks ago. Follow us on Twitter, and please do get in touch with us directly. Now, getting back to today's event, we'll spend the next 85 minutes, I think, together in order to present the most recent regional trends on diaspora engagement, to unpack the specificity of regional realities, and to answer, hopefully, to your questions. We are delighted to have in attendance today representatives of governments, diaspora organizations, civil society, international organizations, and other actors. So thank you one more time for joining us. Certainly, the COVID-19 reality will also impact the level of engagement in the years ahead of us, and it is salient to deepen, I believe, at this critical point in time, our reflection on what lessons we draw from this crisis and what type of engagement we will need in the future for recovery and beyond it. Now, without any further ado, let's move along to the next item. I would like also to announce a few housekeeping details. Please note that the microphones and videos are only active for the panelists. Please also note that we'll have a questions and answer session starting at around 1:30, and you are kindly invited and encouraged to start submitting your questions and comments in the Q&A section that is displayed at the bottom of the Zoom window, so you can see it at the bottom. Questions can be typed in French, Spanish, and English, so feel free to use either your mother tongue or the language you are proficient in. And please also note that a recording of the webinar will be made available at a later date in all the 3 languages that I have just mentioned. Now, I'm very delighted to introduce our panelists in order in which they will speak. I would like to start with my own colleague, Dr. Fanny Titel-Mosse, who is the Knowledge Management and Research Officer of the EU Global Diaspora Facility, along with Fanny, who did a tremendous job in coordinating the research exercise, and I would like to thank her for that. We have a panel of excellent researchers from different countries of the world. Dr. Olga Gulina, who is the founder and CEO of the Rus MPI-UG Institute of Migration Policy. She holds a PhD in migration law from the University of Potsdam in Germany and a PhD in constitutional law from the Bashkir State University in the Russian Federation. Then Dr. Manuel Orozco, who is currently a Senior Director of Remittances and Development and the Inter-American Dialogue. He is also a fellow for the Center for International Development at Harvard University, a Senior Migration Remittances Advisor for the International Fund for Agricultural Development. Manuel holds a PhD in Political Science from the University of Texas at Austin. Next is Mr. Paul Asquith, who is the Engagement and Policy Manager at the African Foundation for Development, also known as AFORD in UK, a leading African diaspora organization where he leads the research and policy advocacy work. He is also a research associate at the Center of African Studies, University of London. Ms. Vani Swarupa Murali is our next researcher who works at the Institute of South Asian Studies in the National University of Singapore. She works on domestic issues within India, and she's currently pursuing her PhD from the National University of Singapore. And last but not least, again, our own colleague, Mr. Alexander Porteret, who is Associate Project Officer with the EU Global Diaspora Facility. He previously worked in the Pacific region, and therefore he covered this region for this research exercise. I would like to thank one more time all the researchers for having collaborated with us and to congratulate all of them on the excellent work done. Now, let me please give the floor to Fanny, who will shed light on the research conducted under the umbrella of the EU Global Diaspora Facility and some key global findings from this interesting exercise. Fanny, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Oleg, and thank you everyone for being here with us today. I must say that I'm quite excited to share with you the first results of our global mapping on diaspora engagement. The purpose of the mapping that we are going to present today is to get a first overview of what exists in terms of diaspora engagement, looking at policies, trends, and practices, as well as to catalog diaspora-related institutions across the globe. Overall, the mapping helps to create a better understanding of the interests and challenges faced by countries of origin worldwide when it comes to engaging with their respective diaspora. So the first round of the mapping was conducted this year between the graphic recording just started was conducted this year between January and April, and we covered so far 50 countries that are spread across the world. So we covered Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, and the Pacific. In order to choose the countries to be mapped, a comprehensive methodology was used based on a series of objective criteria. But what we were really aiming at doing was to cover a wide range of countries of origin, of all sizes, representing all levels of economic development and institutionalization of diaspora engagement, including some countries that were already quite advanced in terms of diaspora engagement, such as Moldova, for example, but also to cover others that we knew less about, like the Pacific region, for example. So the first 50 country fact sheets are now available on the EUDIF website via an interactive map, which also includes different sets of statistics for over 150 countries. And in autumn, we are going to add over 50 new countries to this map, and yeah, the content will be regularly updated. So if you have not yet looked at our website, I invite you to do so after the webinar. Now, before I give the floor to the different researchers that worked on developing the country fact sheets, I would like to give a few general highlights of the results. The first one is that we can observe a slow evolution towards more institutionalization of diaspora engagement, as already mentioned by Oleg. From the countries that we have mapped so far, we saw that most diaspora engagement policies have been adopted in the last 6 years, and most of them in African countries. In Africa, 9 out of the 19 countries that were mapped have a diaspora engagement policy or are in the process of drafting one. But the institutionalization of diaspora engagement globally started already over a decade ago with Asia or Latin America, for example. Additionally, only over actually 2/3 of the countries that were mapped so far have at least one institution in charge of diaspora engagement. But we will also see during the presentation that this does not always mean that it leads to more or to better diaspora engagement. We also noticed that an increase in the interest towards diaspora engagement from the countries of origin led to some changes in terms of political rights of the diaspora. Many countries in Africa, for example, are starting to open up the right to vote for diaspora members and to allow dual citizenship, because it is considered as a necessary step to enable diaspora engagement. In other countries where dual citizenship is not yet allowed, such as in Indonesia, China, or Kazakhstan, for example, diaspora cards are being developed in order to grant rights to diaspora members that are almost the same than those of citizens. All these points will be further developed during the presentations by our panelists. Now, when we look at the main trends in terms of diaspora engagement, we can highlight that some are similar across all regions. For example, it's quite common to see governments being interested in increasing remittances, attracting more investments through diaspora bonds, for example, but also generally in keeping links with the diaspora through the organization of events and the building of networks. But we can also see differences as each region has its own priorities. For example, Latin America has a larger focus on remittances and digitalization. The Pacific has a large focus on circular migration schemes and humanitarian relief. And Central Asia, for example, is a lot about identity, culture, or repatriation, as Olga will present shortly. Similarly, when we look at the main sectors of interest of countries of origin, we can also see that sectors such as education, health, entrepreneurship, and tourism are found in every region. But again, some regional specificities can be highlighted and some parallel can actually be drawn between regions. So for example, Africa and Asia have a particular interest in sustainable energy, technology, ICT, and infrastructure, while Latin America and Central Asia and Eastern Europe have a particular interest in youth, innovative technology, and agriculture. And Asia and the Pacific, for example, share an interest for climate change issues. Finally, and this is my last point before we will start the presentation, what also came out from this mapping exercise is that overall, countries of origin still have a limited capacity to mobilize the diaspora. And there are three main reasons for that that have been underlined in all regions covered by the mapping. The first one is a lack of or an inadequacy of institutions in charge of diaspora engagement, but also the fact that the legal and the policy frameworks in place can be outdated or not applied in practice. The second one is the lack of knowledge that countries of origin have of their diaspora and its potential. And this can actually lead to the inability to build adequate diaspora engagement policies and programs and to effectively communicate with them. But also, there is a lack of knowledge from the diaspora on existing engagement possibilities and schemes proposed by their countries of origin. And the last point is that we can often see a lack of trust on both parts. So I believe that this mapping is a first step towards bridging the knowledge gap in this field, and that it will help us through EUDIF activities to support evidence-based action to enhance diaspora engagement and to support countries of origin and diaspora networks or diaspora organizations based in Europe to engage and to collaborate more effectively with each other. Now, I will stop here and I will let the researchers give you more insights about the findings in their particular regions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fanny, for this overview at global level. So I'm very curious now to see how the researchers will basically unpack the realities that you have just described at regional level. Please do not forget that we have a web page. I'm very grateful to Charlotte, who has already shared the link of our portal in the chat section. We also have a Twitter account, so please do follow us. Also on the web page, you can go on the Diaspora Engagement Map section and you will find the country fiches of those 50 countries, those first 50 countries that have been covered by our research exercise. Also, a very important detail to make this event more animated and visually dynamic. We have with us a professional graphic recorder. Her name is Maria. Thank you, Maria, for being with us today, who will be switching between screen sharing and camera views. You have just seen the map, so she will be doing the same thing also when the experts will speak. She will try to draw certain things on the maps. Please do follow what Maria does in real time. Now, let's get to the crux of the matter by inviting the researchers to present, as I said before, the main findings of their important work. They will have, I would say, roughly speaking, 4 or 5 minutes each to provide us with a short overview of the regions that they have analyzed. I know it's very difficult to make all the information very compact within 4 or 5 minutes, but we'll hopefully have some time for discussions and additional questions during this webinar. Now, Dr. Gulina will have the floor. Olga, could you please introduce the main trends in Eastern Europe and Central Asia when it comes to diaspora engagement?
I will start my microphone. Hello, everyone. Before I get started to answer your question, I would like to thank the project team for having me here and your question. You're totally right. Diaspora policy and diaspora institutionalization policy have its own specific in the Central and East European countries, as well in the Central Asia. Firstly, it's due to some circumstances. First, the reason for this specific, it's that all countries in my research profile, they have their common past. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Moldova, and Ukraine were countries in my research profile, and all of them have their common past. After the dissolution of Soviet Union in 1991, all those countries gained their independence. It implies on their modern and past migration and diaspora policies. The second reason, most countries in my research profile have a vague terminology related to the issue of diaspora. Before those countries became independent in 1991, the term diaspora had been used very seldom, and a phenomenon of diaspora hadn't attracted attention among politicians, ordinary people, or some specialists. Nowadays, the tendency is other way around. Diasporas have many names in newly independent states. Lawmakers of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Ukraine, Moldova have used different terms to describe a group of people living outside the homeland. For example, a very broad definition is the term compatriots. Compatriots, it's a country fellow who preserve linguistic, cultural tradition and who are interested in the motherland, who wants to preserve ties to the motherland. Kyrgyzstan broadly used definition Kairilman, which literally means a returnee. Ukraine used very different terminology to describe Ukrainians living abroad. But what is more interesting, Ukraine issued certificates for Ukrainians living abroad in order to confirm their ties to the country. Also very interesting situation with Kazakhstan. Lawmakers of Kazakhstan created legislation and also very broadly used term Orelman, which literally means a returnee. But a couple of years ago, the president of the country announced that Orelman, which described ethnic Kazakhs who are interested to return to Kazakhstan, has a negative meaning or a negative perception in Kazakhstan. Therefore, he suggests and announced that a new term has to be introduced in the legislation. And since the beginning of 2020, lawmakers of Kazakhstan started to use term Kangas, which literally in Kazakh language means a person with the same blood. The institutionalization policy has also its own specific design in all newly independent states. Before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, no one country has their own institution related to diaspora issue. After 1991, only two countries, Georgia and Armenia, created institution on diaspora issues at the ministerial level. Unfortunately, all those institutions, ministry in Georgia and Armenia, were abolished. Until 2019, Armenia has a ministry for diaspora issue. Since 2 years, since 2019, as I told, Armenia in Armenia, we have the Office of High Commissioner for Diaspora issue and the direct subordination of the Prime Ministry. All countries in my research profile, they have a very interesting installation of non-governmental actors who engage in a diaspora and diaspora policy in the newly independent states. For example, Kazakhstan has established Forum Otanda Star. In Kyrgyzstan, operated Forum Mekendesh. In Armenia, there are a lot of forums who work with diaspora and nationals living abroad. In Armenia, we have All Armenian Fund, which operated since 1991. Can you see it's a very broad picture, and there is many interesting detail, but I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olga, for this very first insights into Eastern Europe and Central Asia. I'm pretty much over the big question, but in any case, I will try to pick up on what you have just said a little bit later to delve more into the reality of these two regions at the end of the day. I would like now to turn to Dr. Orozco, who is going to elaborate on the realities or different realities and dynamics across Latin America and the Caribbean. So again, we speak about different regions within a bigger region. So Manuel, please take the floor.
Good day, everyone. And again, like Olga, I want to congratulate the organizers and Fanny and Alexandre. They've done an excellent job. It's a great idea of this project. Let me raise a couple of issues, perhaps three: how diaspora is conceptualized or visualized in the Latin American and Caribbean context. Second, what is the extent of engagement? And third, how does the COVID-19 crisis has affected many of the countries of the diaspora. In the first case, we can think of the concept of diaspora in Latin America and the Caribbean to be defined in relationship to three main traits. It's contextual, it is geographic, and it's functional. On the one hand, there is a perceived, it's mostly a consequential development of the use of the term diaspora as it relates to the realities of the global age. It's mostly a concept that has been perceived in relationship to the space, to distance. Most of the countries that define their communities living abroad as diasporas do so in relationship to the distant brother, the distant friend, and is functional. That is related mostly to economic reasons. It's a migrant worker, a person that commits to take care of their families and send money back home. It is a rather early definition of diaspora, early understanding of it. The extent of engagement that governments have or the states have of their diasporas is also has a relatively low position in the policy priorities. It is perceived as a concept that relates mostly to issues of consular relations to some extent, institutional policies, creating ministries, etc. But mostly it's rather economic. The engagement that governments perceived to have with their diasporas is one of establishing some sort of institutional engagement through economic policies, predominantly with regards to remittances. They try to leverage remittances for economic growth, but the approach is relatively limited. In most cases, the type of policies that are done have to do with lowering the transaction cost of remittances or to some extent with financial inclusion. Very few countries actually have any established policy of economic engagement. Mexico is one of them, El Salvador is another one, Guatemala is another one, but in most cases it occurs predominantly in support from international cooperation. International cooperation has been perhaps the most intervening factor in enabling the linkage between state engagement and diasporas in economic aspects. The impact of COVID has been dramatic in Latin America. As you know, Latin American and Caribbean countries have experienced one of the highest rates relative to their populations. And the most affected countries are also the most fragile states and are also the countries that have a significant diaspora population. We're talking about Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, Haiti, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Bolivia. These are some of the most fragile states in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also are the ones that have strong diaspora communities sending money back home. And the impact of COVID has been detrimental with regards to sending money. So far, the decline of remittances is, as of June of this year, has dropped somewhere at around an average of 10%. We estimate that the flow is going to be much lower than that, but it varies from country to country. In some places, for example, Dominican Republic, the decline has been negative 7%. In Honduras has been 0%, no growth, but it is significant to see the impact. Overall, the governments are clear that the diasporas are suffering through this situation, but there is very little they can do. There is a lot of limitation on the type of policies that they can implement, partly because there is no knowledge on how to intervene in the economic realm. But for the most part, it's also a byproduct of the crude understanding of what they see diaspora means in the broader context of the state. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manuel, also for alluding to the concept of diaspora. Maybe we'll have some questions in this regard, because we also saw it within the framework of our project, that the way how diaspora is being conceptualized or defined can create some not only interpretation issues, but more importantly, some policy issues, and eventually some actions. But also, indeed, for highlighting the impact of COVID-19, I will also guess that there will be some other questions where we can discuss further on about the impact of coronavirus, in particular on remittances. Now, the next speaker is Paul, who has covered Africa. So I go right to him. Paul, can you please elaborate a little bit on the African reality? Again, take into account that Africa is a huge continent.
Absolutely, and with great pleasure. And thank you for inviting me to join you all today. I can't speak for the other researchers, but it's been really fascinating seeing what's happening in the other regions, and also the analysis overall that Fanny's so helpfully put together. Now, Fanny's already touched on one of the kind of key themes for the African region, which is increasing recognition of the diaspora as equal citizens. So you see increasing trend towards dual citizenship, but also towards diaspora voting. And I think this is important in enabling diaspora engagement, because it's about treating the diaspora as participants more fully in the economic, social, and political life of the country of origin. The other two kind of broad trends I want to sketch out briefly now. The first is a shift in kind of economic models, if you like. So a shift from a remittance-driven economic model, a guest worker model, to one where the diaspora are invited, are courted to invest in the country, to return on a shorter and longer term basis, and to enable skills and technology transfer and exchange. And this process has coincided with globalization and the increasing integration of African economies and African labor into the global economy. And as you've seen this in a number of African states, especially in North and West Africa. So you have this shift away from guest workers sending back money with the expectation they'll return home one day, to one where there's a recognition that the diaspora are citizens living abroad, with lives outside, who may have put roots down in other places. And so the terms of the engagement have changed. And increasingly African states are looking to invite the diaspora to invest in land and property, to invest in renewable energy, but also to transfer skills, expertise, and knowledge that they've gained in their countries of residence. At the same time, there's been increasing political drive for integration across the continent. And in 2012, the African Union published its Santon Declaration on the Global African Diaspora Summit, which declared that the worldwide African diaspora constituted the sixth region of Africa, and called upon African governments to recognize and involve the diaspora in national development and economic growth. And this has prompted and helped African states develop new policies, programs, structures, and frameworks for diaspora engagement. The other point I want to draw attention to today is the increasing formalization and professionalization of these diaspora engagement structures, frameworks, and programs, including personnel. And many, if not most, African states have dedicated diaspora departments and diaspora policies, although some still do not. Typically, these will sit in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In a few examples, they have dedicated standalone ministries. So Mali and Egypt come to mind there. And predictably, perhaps, these trends are most obviously visible in the countries involved in the Rabat and Khartoum processes. And I think it's fair to say that these countries have been beneficiaries of significant external support from the European Union, from European Union member states, but also international intergovernmental institutions such as the UN Family, World Bank, African Development Bank, etc. I think it's fair to say that policy development and formalization and also implementation processes in many African states can tend to be quite slow and also opaque. And the lack of formalization of policies can, in many cases, be linked to domestic political pressures, disputes over allocation of resources, and interdepartmental kind of competition about who should have control for the diaspora brief. But I think it's also important to stress that at a continental level, the development of the African Union Citizens and Diaspora Directorate, which is AU-CIDO, has also been important in providing leadership and coordination to African Union member states. I think I'm going to stop now because my time is short, but I look forward to further questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I see that we have already some questions in relation to Africa, so we'll come back to them a little bit later. I think it's fascinating what you have just described in terms of the role of the continental or regional integration process, which really prompted the institutions a new thinking of the role of diaspora in development and the creation of so many institutions and the establishment of so many strategies. So again, I hope that we'll come back to this in a couple of seconds. I kindly remind all of you that you can share your comments and raise your questions in the Q&A or in the chat section of the Zoom menu panel. Now let's move to Asia. So as you can see, our event is truly global. We're trying to capture the trends in different regions and on different continents of the globe. Now I would like to turn to Vani, who has researched the Asian context. Vani, the floor is yours.
Thank
Vani,
you. Yes,
okay.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you also for having me as part of this webinar as well as the project. Like Paul said, it has been really fascinating hearing about the research that has been done in other regions. I will be covering some of the key factors that help to create an enabling environment in Asia and that are conducive to diaspora engagement. These factors might also be useful recommendations for countries at the beginning of the spectrum of diaspora engagement in order to use as a sort of guideline. So in the countries that I looked into in Asia, creating an enabling environment essentially rests on three aspects that could be implemented. So firstly, diaspora engagement has been relatively conducive in countries that linked the importance of diaspora with constructive development back at home. So this could be in the form of social unity and stability, skills training, remittances, or foreign investment. So for instance, Bangladesh actually launched this theme called Migration for Development. And given that Bangladesh is actually mostly a labor sending country, this theme targeted the positive effects of migration, such as the large amounts of remittances to use for the development of Bangladesh. Likewise, Sri Lanka also began to engage its overseas community for the future of its own growth by engaging their diaspora in key sectors such as housing, economic diversification, as well as tourism. So this way, an enabling environment is built where the diaspora feels that they can contribute productively to their home country. The second thing was that countries work together with international organizations such as the IOM and the ILO to implement migration programs in their country. This is especially crucial for countries that are just starting out in the spectrum of engagement, as the organizations are then able to provide a good guide for them as well as provide resources, funding, and reach in order to tap onto their diaspora. So a good example of this would be in the case of Afghanistan, where they had identified the importance of diaspora to development and tapped on IOM to implement their diaspora policy. So the IOM then helped to collect data on the diaspora and helped to identify critical areas of diaspora engagement and capacity building. So it also initiated the RQA program to tap into the expertise of qualified Afghans abroad to engage them in the reconstructive progress. So this is actually really successful. By 2018, I think 1,600 Afghan experts returned home from over 29 countries, and they were placed in pretty key positions within the government and the private sector to contribute to development of the country. The last thing is that it is important to have a coordinating body on the ground in order to liaise between the government and the diaspora. So this could be either in the form of a ministry for diaspora affairs or a very strong diaspora body within the civil society. So in the case of China, they have this Overseas Chinese Affairs Office and Committee, which was actually really useful in coming up with innovative schemes to attract talent back through things like a talent plan or industry parks. In the case of Indonesia, there's this thing called the Indonesian Diaspora Network. They were really relatively successful in lobbying for more diaspora rights, amendments in citizenship laws, and the use of the diaspora card that Fanny mentioned just now. Some of the other key sectors of diaspora engagement in this group of countries, like Fanny said, are energy, science and tech, as well as climate change. So in the case of energy, I would say that there's Ujialo Nepal is a scheme that was promoted by the Non-Resident Nepali Association, NRNA, to replace traditional electric bulbs in Nepal with LED lights. So the project saw NRNA work with the Nepal Electricity Authority to replace 10 million traditional bulbs with LED lights to boost energy savings in Nepal. So in this way, like similarly, I would also say in the case of science and tech, the Chinese state and local governments have implemented a knowledge-intensive development model by building on high-tech industrial development parks, STEM laboratories, and other R&D facilities, so as to attract new generations of diasporic Chinese to invest back in China. These local high-tech parks are partners that then offer advice and support in matters of attracting overseas specialists, technology, and capital. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Fanny, and thanks a lot for bringing in this strong development nexus into the discussion. I think indeed that in the Asian context, we see that the governments are determined and they're taking concrete actions to make the connection between diaspora, migration, and development very, very strong. So one more time, we'll get back to all these interesting and fascinating findings of the research. Now I'm turning to the final speaker of this round, our colleague Alex, who will have the floor. He will elaborate a little bit on the Pacific region. Even though we didn't cover too many countries in the region, still I think it's very interesting to see what is going on in that region and what are the main trends. Alex, please do make your intervention now.
Yes, thank you very much, Oleg. So yes, 6 Pacific countries were included in the first phase of the diaspora engagement mapping. These were Fiji, Kiribati, Micronesia, Papua New Guinea, Tonga, and Tuvalu. And when looking at diaspora engagement in the Pacific, one of the first trends that can be noticed is that many countries in the region have significant diasporas overseas. And of course, the absolute numbers are quite small compared to what we can see in other regions. But in fact, several Pacific countries have more citizens living abroad than at home. It is the case, for instance, of Tonga. And in contrast, there are very few Pacific diasporans in Europe, and the main host countries for Pacific diaspora communities by far are Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. Another key element is the importance of labor migration in the region. Several Pacific countries are actively involved in seasonal labor schemes with neighboring countries, such as the Seasonal Worker Program in Australia or the Recognized Seasonal Employer Scheme in New Zealand. And as a result of this, these same countries today rely heavily on remittances sent by their diasporas. For instance, in 2019, Tonga remained the country that counted the highest share of remittances as a percentage of its GDP worldwide, with more than 38%. And other countries like Samoa, Tuvalu, and the Marshall Islands also rely very heavily on remittances. Therefore, several Pacific countries today are deploying targeted efforts to encourage the flow of remittances into their economies with initiatives such as remittance vouchers, for instance. Going beyond remittances, the Pacific diaspora is also increasingly important for other sectors of the economy in countries of origin. And it contributes, for instance, to the development of the tourism industry in the region. Over the past years, the Pacific diaspora also emerged as a powerful humanitarian actor, and it was able to support disaster relief and recovery when Pacific countries were hit by cyclones, for instance. And this aspect is particularly important, as you know that the region is severely challenged by the effects of climate change and that it is prone to increasingly frequent natural disasters. Another interesting trend is the fact that culture and cultural preservation is an important aspect of diaspora engagement in many countries in the region, as Pacific diasporas actively engage for the promotion and the preservation of their cultural heritage and identity in the countries in which they live. However, and this is my last remark, today very few diaspora engagement policies are in place or being developed in the region, and the lack of specific policy frameworks is an obstacle to further diaspora engagement, which has been identified repeatedly during the mapping. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex. Also bringing in a new dimension, which is disaster relief and the tourism industry. As we can all see, each region has, of course, its own features and peculiarities, and I think that also creates the richness of diaspora engagement discussion and discourse. Thank you so very much to all of you for your compelling and crisp introductions. Now we are almost halfway through our event, and I would like to gradually open now the floor to discussions. I will start getting some questions that have been raised in the chat and the Q&A section of the Zoom window. And at the same time, I would like also maybe to delve a little bit into some interesting issues or unique features of the regions that we have covered through this research exercise. Maybe if I may to get back to Olga, she explained to all of us a little bit about, let's say, the institutional framework in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, but she also mentioned very briefly about a unique trend for this region, which is the development of repatriation programs of ethnic citizens displaced, in particular after the dissolution of USSR. If you can please give us more examples in this respect and what these repatriation programs entail and how they contribute to diaspora engagement between those countries that put in place these programs and those ethnic citizens that reside somewhere abroad.
Thank you, Oleg, for your question. Definitely, repatriation policy of the newly independent states in my research profile remain the main pillar of migration policy of those countries. Nearly 7 countries of the former Soviet Union states, now they are newly independent states. It's Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, and Moldova have established a special repatriation program with initiatives targeting co-ethnics living in other countries. Current repatriation policies in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Moldova, and Ukraine differ by target group, differ by state repatriation measures, provision for immigration and citizenship acquisition. But what unite those countries, that all countries of the former Soviet Union became interested in getting their core ethnics to get them back. I will give two examples of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, because their repatriation policy have some specific. As I told, most repatriation policies around the globe established in the order to decline demography inside the country. Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan are two special examples because their repatriation programs of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan aim to increase erasure of title nation, Kazakh and Kyrgyz, in line with their idea of building a national state. And most repatriation programs in countries from my research profile, they aim at inviting co-ethnics back to support their resettlement, to strengthen the ties, and state provide a lot of program initiatives, starting from enrollment children to the school up to provide some bank credits with a very low loan ratio. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olga. Now I would like to raise a question from the chat that was raised by Mr. Rodriguez Mutende from Kenya, I believe, who asks, how far can we argue that the diaspora is hugely a financial remittances instrument? Of course, the context is raised, the question is raised in the context of Africa, but I would like to extend this question also to Manuel, because he touched a little bit based on the impact of COVID on remittances. So to which extent diaspora is regarded as a financial instrument? And if Paul, you can elaborate a little bit on the African context, and then we'll move ahead with Manuel in relation to Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thank you for your excellent question. And it's certainly true that remittances continue to form an important part of the national economies of several African states. I think it's also fair to say that that is shifting slightly or is maturing. And if a generation ago, you could characterize the relationship between African states and the diaspora as one of pay but no say. So a common complaint we hear from people in the diaspora is that they're treated as cash cows by their governments in countries of origin. I'd argue that African governments certainly have become slowly somewhat more sophisticated in terms of how they seek to engage with the diasporas, specifically in relation to their financial contributions. So yes, remittances are still very important in some countries. I'll give you an example. Somalia, remittances make up between 25 and 30% of GDP. But that's arguably an outlier. And increasingly, rather than just seeking to harvest diaspora and migrant remittances, African states are looking to develop increased diaspora investments in land, in property, in different sectors. So it's an evolution, a kind of maturation of the kind of relationship. But it's certainly the case that many people in the diaspora perceive that they're treated as a cash cow. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Manuel, what about Latin America and the Caribbean?
Thank you. I think it's pretty much goes the same with what Paul is saying. For the most part, and there is a very crude understanding of the diaspora, or not even understanding, but recognition of the diaspora. Mostly, it is an instrumental consideration in terms of the economic. I have argued that they are perceived as a necessary economic evil with regards particularly to remittances. The issue of investment was actually perceived first before remittances. And when there was no skilled knowledge addressed with regards to how to tap with the transnational economic engagement, promoting investment of the diaspora, then they just limited themselves to the issue of remittances. But mostly the consideration of remittances is just as enabling the transfer of money and let it be whichever way it can go. So there are very limited considerations as to how to leverage the flow of remittances themselves, much less to anything else. For example, there are very important lessons and experiences and benchmarks that you can implement on how to leverage remittances for financial inclusion purposes in most of the developing world where this is a key issue. But the governments don't really see it as a priority. And part of the reason is that to them, more than a cash cow, there is actually before that the recognition that out-migration is an important escape valve to deal with the large unemployment and labor integration challenges that these countries have. So this is perhaps the main issue. And I think that needs to be problematized still in the discourse. We've been working on this for more than 20 years. The debate continues to be almost stalled on the same issues, transaction cost, but there is still very limited consideration of how much of a priority the diaspora represents in the global context. That's why I say diasporas are consequential regarded with relationship to distance, but also very instrumental to the economic issues.
Thank you very much, Manuel. I see that we continue getting in a lot of questions. It's very exciting, so I'll try to make justice to all of them. If you can still stay a little bit in the African context, and I have another question addressed by Guy Paulin to Paul. Do you have statistics of the African diaspora that returns to invest in the country of origin?
Thank you for your excellent question. The short answer is there's not enough adequate data or information about the levels of diaspora investment in their countries of origin. And it's something that my own organization has been doing some work on for the past few years. We're currently developing the methodology for a diaspora direct investment index. So similar to you'd have for foreign direct investment to sort of track these investment flows into the continent. However, data collection remains a real challenge, and we have recommended to African governments, as well as to other stakeholders, that they need to invest significantly in data collection to improve the accuracy of the picture we have about diaspora investments. We know from World Bank figures, for example, that around 30% of remittances are used for productive investments. It's very difficult to track investment flows outside of remittance flows without increased investment in data and data collection. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe a question now to Vani and to Manuel, because I think both of you mentioned a little bit about the role of embassies and consulates. There is a question for Mr. or Mrs. Sarpong. How do you see the role of high commissions and embassies in countries where diaspora reside as regards to diaspora engagement? So maybe Vani, we start with you. What are the realities in Asia?
Yeah, sure. I think I would just like to give an example. I think embassies and high commissions play a really big role in places where that connection has already been established between the diaspora and the home country. So for instance, the Indonesian embassy in Berlin, for example, organizes an annual diaspora forum. So this way they promote a kind of regular dialogue between the diaspora and the Indonesian government. Similarly, also in Indonesia, the Indonesian embassy in Brussels also brings together groups of Indonesian executives and professionals in Europe who are established and, you know, makes kind of skills transfer and talents of the diaspora readily available back home to maybe the Indonesian state agency for aerospace, for instance, and for research and technology. So that way they kind of try to bring the talents that are available through the diaspora back home to kind of help the development initiatives back home.
Thank you, Vani. And then the same question to Dr. Orozco in relation to consulates and embassies, and maybe to elaborate a little bit, if, let's say, diaspora engagement started through these entities, or these entities were mandated at a later stage to handle diaspora relations matter.
Well, I mean, maybe I'm a little bit stoic on all these issues, but in my experience, working with Latin American, even with African countries and some Central Asians, my experience is that policy on diasporas has been extremely, if not mostly, reactive. And that reactiveness translates into the diaspora putting pressure on governments from the very basic issues of allowing them to do the paperwork, passport renewals, etc. And that has pressured them as a matter of numbers to open their consular offices, to expand their offices. But there is very little active recognition on how to act vis-a-vis the communities living abroad. So I think it's just a mostly functional or instrumental consideration about the diasporas. On the economic issues is the same thing. So the most common thread is that they definitely in Latin America and the Caribbean governments have expanded their consular offices, but sometimes they are understaffed. You know, the next level will be the right to vote abroad, and still it's something they don't want to do because governments are afraid that the whole politics will be polarized and turn against their favor for the government in turn. So it's still something that states try to keep a low level of priority by controlling how to engage with the communities.
Thank you. I was anticipating this question. It comes from our friend Martin Russell, who indeed raises a fundamental question, and I would like all of you now to contribute to this discussion. He raises the following question. We have to basically ask all these countries about their diaspora the following: who are they, where are they, and what they are doing? How does this information vary from country to country? What does it best? And I think that Olga and Manuel starting elaborating a little bit on the concept of diaspora. Who are they? What are they? So I think now it's a little bit the moment to further elaborate and delve into this question. And maybe we start again with Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Olga, what is your take on this fundamental question? Olga, please unmute yourself. Olga, please unmute yourself.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Sorry. I just want to tell that it's a very good question. We can spend hours to answer it. I try to be short. Firstly, diaspora policies in the newly independent states, which I mentioned, is under construction, and they're really searching for answer. Who are they? Before dissolution of Soviet Union, before 1991, no one was interested in a diaspora phenomena in those countries. After this, some countries have answered this question, but it was much easier in case of Armenia because they have all diaspora. Some other are still doing this, still try to find the right answer. As I told, some country use very broad definition. They're interested in compatriots. It means country fellows who have linguistic and cultural ties to country. They're interested in ethnic Kazakhs, in ethnic Kyrgyz, and etc. They're also interested in diaspora globally, in labor migrants. I have a feeling that countries from my profile, at least the Central Asian countries, they up to now do not have a right answer to the question, who are they? I will stop here.
Thank you, Olga. Then I wonder if we have the right answer in Africa. In any case, we have the continental framework that defines already who the African diaspora is and what does it entail. Paul, what's your take on this question?
I was about to make exactly that point, Oleg. So in most African states, and certainly this is the African Union position, the definition of diaspora used is where you have up to a grandparent on either side who is a citizen of the country. So it includes first generation migrants, second generation, and third generation, depending on how you kind of measure it. In terms of where the diaspora are, I think it depends largely on which region of Africa you're talking about. For understandable historical reasons and also for reasons of geographical proximity, North Africa and West Africa, important countries of destination, are in Europe. In Southern Africa, it's a slightly different picture, I'd argue. Certainly in terms of countries of settlement, in terms of other Anglophone countries, such as the UK or Australia or Canada. But actually, and this is true for the continent overall, most African diaspora reside in other African countries. And that's perhaps something that's still not as widely understood as it should be. There are some other interesting kind of particularities, and I would draw attention to Mauritius and the Seychelles, which have large diasporas of Indian origin. And so increasingly they're looking towards India and Asia in terms of how they frame their diaspora engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Alex, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this question, basically how the Pacific nations define diaspora. And basically, you already mentioned in your presentation where they are located, but what about the concept, the notion and definition of diaspora?
Well, it's also a very, very timely question in the Pacific. Today, most of the Pacific countries don't actually use the term diaspora. They use the term citizens overseas. It's the case, for instance, of Tonga. But I say that this question is very timely because several countries are also now trying to understand who are the diasporans. And for instance, if we take the case of Fiji, which has one of the most skilled diasporas working in the OECD countries, with a lot of Fijian diasporans working in ICT, you can see that the government has deployed strong efforts to try to understand the profile of its diaspora and to adapt its initiatives to this profile. For instance, the government has put in place a digital program to facilitate investment and information about doing business in Fiji that will be available online. And it is no coincidence if the Fijian government is currently working with IOM on a mapping on the Fijian diaspora in Australia, for instance.
Thank you. Fanny, what is the reality in Asia?
Well, in Asia, I think similar to Olga's case, there are some countries with a historical view of diaspora. So some of them initially frowned upon the concept of diaspora. You know, they even labeled them as enemies of the country, for instance, because they left. So in that sense, some of the countries then now are slowly kind of reverting back and using these diaspora as a way to help rebuild society and use this in a way to kind of build social unity and bridging the gap between what used to be and what is right now. Also in the sense of who they are, I think initially the diaspora is viewed more as labor migration and in that way, whereas now it's kind of moved towards like I said previously, like a migration for development. So they're now viewed as assets to the development of the country. So that then goes to show what they're doing, which is bringing in, you know, remittances, skills, and foreign investment and so on.
Thank you. And Manuel, you have already touched very, very briefly on the concept of diaspora in Latin America and Caribbean, in particular evoking the connection of the economic paradigm. Is there anything else that you would like to add in relation to this question? Manuel?
Yes, I think the main issue is that, again, because of the instrumental, almost opportunistic perception of the communities living abroad, they're mostly focused on the foreign-born immigrants, mostly first generation. There is no integration of ancestry except with very few cases. Perhaps the English Caribbean, Guyana, Jamaica tend to have a more encompassing view of the diaspora as perceived in the traditional classical concept. In terms of the migration population, we're talking about interesting developments. 50% of migrants today are living in and working in the United States. This used to be different 20 years ago, where 75%, nearly 80% of the foreign worker population of Latin American origin was in the US. Now it's scattered within Latin America and Europe. they're mostly construction workers, workers in the hospitality industry, and in the services sector. They are low working class individuals, very low income, and that has been a reality that still governments are unable to recognize from the economic policy point of view. However, the majority of immigrants are predominantly 18%, 20% are working in construction, 30% are working in domestic work, mostly female domestic workers, and the rest, the majority, are working in the hospitality industry, working predominantly in restaurants, busboys, etc. That's the makeup of the what we can call the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora.
Thank you. I would like to bring in now a little bit of perspective from diaspora representatives, and we have a very interesting question from Mr. Vladimir Paspuel, who says, as immigrants, we are concerned about the creation of institutions to manage the diaspora, but most do not respond to and do not develop favorable policies. So the question of favorable policies. But if we interest them as remittance senders, why is there so little interest from governments? Why do we create policies and bodies but no budgets? Maybe Manuel, you start asking this question because it comes from, I guess, from a diaspora representative in Latin America, and I would like to have another round with all the panelists to disentangle a little bit this question.
Well, I mean, I guess my comments are mostly, although I'm an analyst, I've been in this work for more than 20 years, and there is a lot of frustration to realize that governments do not give budgets because they pay lip service to the fact that there is a diaspora. They think that things can be sorted out by themselves. And the reality is that it takes a lot of politics from the diaspora to really exert pressure on their home countries beyond saying we're sending remittances. They have to establish institutional linkages, take relationships with political parties in order to influence the establishment from within, and then enable a budget for their communities. I mean, there are very good examples. For example, Haiti has a Ministry of the Diaspora, but its budget is less than $50,000 a year, and it pays the salary of its staff, and that's as far as it goes. So we need the diaspora to actually organize itself, exercise a political capital within themselves in order to put pressure in the home countries. Some African countries, I think Paul may share that, have tried to, the African diasporas have tried to exert that influence in case of the Ghanaian community, for example, but it takes quite a while to get to that point.
Paul, maybe now I would like to turn to you. You mentioned that in Africa there is a proliferation of strategies, policies, institutions, and so on and so forth. I think this is the right step in the right direction. But from your own assessment and basically experience on the continent, how would you measure the interest of the government vis-a-vis the resources that they put into the implementation of or formalization, as you mentioned before, of the existing policies?
I think that's a very good question, and I agree very much with what Manuel has just said. I think certainly in the African context, you need to distinguish between certain things. So firstly, developing effective diaspora engagement framework structures takes time. It takes significant forward investment if you're ever going to recoup that return on investment. So I think that can make it difficult for African states to prioritize allocation of resources adequately to this area. Secondly, and this is true not just for the African region, but other world regions, historically, there's been a lack of trust between countries of origin, governments in the countries of origin, and their diasporas. Certainly in the African context, this lack of trust stems from a fear that the diaspora are busy plotting coups in Washington or Brussels or London or Paris. Not without reason. There was an attempted coup in Gambia in 2014 by some American Gambians who were former officers in the US Army. But the most important point for me is actually African governments aren't very good at communicating what their policies and frameworks are. So there's a bit of a disconnect between what the diaspora can learn about what opportunities are out there and how those opportunities are communicated. And that disconnect, I would argue, creates a lot of frustration within the diaspora, and also arguably leads to misunderstandings within governments in countries of origin.
Thank you, Olga. I think you started your introduction at the beginning of this webinar by saying that diaspora attracted a lot of attention from politicians in the region that you have covered through this research. How would you play the interest of those institutions, including ministries, because you also gave some examples of institutions created at the ministerial level, and basically the resources that those governmental entities put into implementing their engagement strategies?
Thank you. Interestingly, all what Manuel mentioned applies to the countries from my research profile. The budgeting in financial, it's one side of the situation. I would also like change an angle and say the essential issue also, who of interest to the states, or better to say, what kind of a group of countrymen living abroad are of interest to the states. And here we observe a very interesting tendency that youth people and those who interested to preserve linguistic and cultural ties with the homeland country are of interest to the states. States are ready to finance and to support only mostly initiatives, programs related to preserving linguistic ties, cultural events, and etc. And what is important, they do it through their foundation. As I mentioned, Kazakhstan established the Star Foundation, they have some Make and Dish Foundation in Kazakhstan, and etc. This is the main proposal, maintaining contacts with organization, diaspora, countrymen who want to keep their language, their cultural tradition, and etc. I will say there is only one exception, it's Armenia, and I know that Armenian diaspora members who long time reside in Russia, they finance, support, and started initiative which called Armenia 2020, Armenia 2030. And this idea, it's like the bring knowledge, transfer knowledge, startups from other country back to Armenia. And this is like only one exception.
Thank you very much, Olga. I think I will raise another question that I would like all of you to a certain extent to answer before we'll move into kind of more practical question linked to the project itself and the way how the research is conducted, because there are also a couple of questions linked to that. There is a very good question from Asier Ansorena. Sorry if I pronounce your name correctly. It's a question that builds upon one of the Manuel's comments. Is there space and relevance in providing opportunities for diasporas to gain influence in their countries of origin by creating meaningful spaces to engage with civil society organizations and social entrepreneurs in their countries of origin? So basically, how can diaspora gain more influence and have an impact on what their countries of origin attempt to do? I would like to have this question answered by all of you, and maybe this will be, if you wish, sort of wrap up intervention from your side. So maybe this time we start with Asia. Vani, you have the floor, please. From your research, how would you see this question on gaining influence?
I think in the case of Asia, actually, one thing that was really useful was giving the space over to diaspora organizations that are civil society organizations. So they are based back in the home country. So for instance, in Nepal, there's the Non-Resident Nepali Association. So with this association, the government actually is able to work together with them in order to kind of create a global network of Nepali migrants. And then they all kind of streamline their energy and resources to make the diaspora kind of like a catalyst of economic and social transformation back in Nepal. So I think, and also this organization also, it then emerged as the kind of central organization for Nepali migrants. So Nepali migrants diaspora will then reach out to the NRNA, which will then transfer the needs and requirements and resources back to the government. And so it kind of works as a three-way partnership. So I think that's a pretty useful way to look at it. If you give the space over to a civil society organization, that is also one way to look at it.
Thank you. Alex, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on the Pacific region.
Well, yes, in the case of the Pacific, if you take on one hand the contribution of Pacific diasporas to the local economies in countries of origin, and on the other hand the actual influence that the diaspora has on developments in the countries of origin, there is a huge gap. And from a few studies that have been published, it is clear that many Pacific diasporans have the feeling that their financial contributions are taken for granted, but on the other hand, they have very few rights in the countries of origin. They are not represented in national assemblies or parliaments, and their influence on what happens in the country is basically today limited to what can be found on social media. So it's really limited to statements and sometimes meeting with representatives of the government when they visit the countries of residence. But I think that in the Pacific, much more could be done. Yes.
Thank you, Alex. Paul, as far as Africa is concerned, you have already mentioned about political rights, voting rights as sort of leverage to influence the local politics. Can you please elaborate further on this question on how diaspora can gain influence in their countries of origin? And also this question relates to civil society organizations and social entrepreneurs. And I think you mentioned one of the trends in Africa, which is into entrepreneurship and investments.
Thank you. Another excellent question. And I would agree with, I think it was Manuel who said earlier that generally governments don't concede entitlements or rights to the diasporas without pressure from those diasporas. So you have the expression, if you don't ask, you don't get. And diaspora organizations, individual actors and communities in countries of settlement and also transit have been very active in lobbying and advocacy activities, both in their country of residence, but especially in their country of origin. So that kind of pressure, if you like, political pressure, is a significant driver, even when there are no formal political rights or entitlements. So let's use an example. So with let's take Nigeria, for example. Nigeria does not allow diaspora voting. However, the diaspora remain an important political constituency, kind of informally, simply by virtue of the scale of diaspora remittances and investments. So if the total remittances to Nigeria last year were about $21 billion US dollars, the entire federal budget of Nigeria was $18 billion. So that makes policymakers in Nigeria kind of pay greater attention to what the interests of their diaspora communities are. However, I think it's also important to point out that a lot of the initiatives, a lot of the energy, a lot of the dynamism around diaspora engagement has come from diaspora communities and organizations themselves. Some of the best examples across the African continent have been diaspora-led, diaspora-created, diaspora-implemented, without any real support from governments, whether in Africa or in Europe. So, and you're absolutely right that forms of diaspora activity and intervention aren't restricted to just sending money. Increasingly, African diaspora are setting up businesses, especially social enterprises on the economy, partly to reduce dependency on remittance pressure, shall we say, from extended family members. There's a tendency, you know, when you're sending money to a family back home, the money can get chopped quite easily. This creates fights. So it becomes a way of perhaps avoiding kind of these disagreements. You invest some of this money in productive investments that generate an income for extended family members or community members back home.
Thank you, Paul. And now I'll quote you and I'll slightly rephrase the question that I would like to address to Manuel. If you ask, do you get in Latin America?
We keep asking. I think let me summarize this. The term space is, I mean, let me point this out. The term diaspora itself is a euphemism for migrant, but governments do not want to use it because they're afraid of the politics behind it, the politics in relationship to the European Union, the United States, etc. So you use the term diaspora, but the reality is that we're talking about migrant workers whose economic rights and their political rights are very limited, both in the host country and in the home country. So the role of international cooperation here is essential to deal with this space. The space, I call it opportunity and preparation. And it's important for the diaspora to create the opportunity and the international development community to provide the preparation on technical assistance to strengthen the political capital of the diaspora, to give governments institutional development tools on how to develop better or how to consolidate better institutions, government agencies to liaise with the diaspora, but also to have better tools of transnational economic engagement. You're not only talking about remittances, you're talking about what we call nostalgic trade, migrant capital investment, diaspora philanthropy. These are four key important economic activities. The fifth one, which is also neglected, is knowledge transfer. All of these issues really require a lot of technical assistance, and we're still very at early stages, unfortunately, on how to leverage these things for economic development. Yet, in 54 developing countries, remittances alone represent at least 5% of the country's GDP. So anything that occurs in the global economy will be affecting the home countries to a large extent because of the flow of remittances, whether they go up or down. So we have to have preparation on technical assistance for economic development through transnational economic engagement, but also create the opportunity by building the political capital of the diaspora.
Olga, and you are the last panelist to speak today. What are the leeways and basically the tools that diaspora in Eastern Europe and Central Asia use to gain influence in their home countries?
Yeah, I just want to say that diaspora policy are often politicized in those countries, and diasporan fellows living abroad have become a very powerful instruments which intervene effectively in sending remittances, building up economy, keeping cultural and linguistic heritage, and etc. But on the same way, diaspora issue are a substantial instrument of the country's international and domestic agenda. I only have time to give one example. Since 2002, the draft law of Armenia's regulation of overseas employment has not been adopted by national parliament because national authority, Armenian state, do not want to be perceived as encouraging immigration from the country. And this example tells us everything. It means that all of us have a lot of job to do.
Thank you, Olga. I think looking at the time, we have to draw, unfortunately and regrettably, this webinar to a close. I do apologize for not having raised all your questions. We'll try to answer to you by email, because there are also a couple of questions on the methodology that you have used on the countries that we have covered, on some statistics. So we'll try to answer to your question by email at a later stage. We have seen that the diaspora engagement landscape is extremely rich. It continues to evolve quite rapidly, and I think we believe that it is necessary to conduct regular and multidimensional research at global level, and to continue having this type of discussions, to exchange on the do's and the don'ts, on the practices that have worked out, but also, more importantly, what else should be done, and how indeed we can eventually, as an ultimate goal, build more trust between governments and diaspora organizations. And I tend to say very often that diaspora is sort of an unfinished business, because indeed there is so much still to be done in this very particular area. Just a couple of words, because I look at the watch and we still have only 2 minutes. What's next in terms of the EU Global Diaspora Facility? So basically, we'll continue conducting research by covering additional 50 countries. So I hope that somewhere in autumn, we'll continue having this debate and very interactive discussion on what's next. Also, the findings and the outcomes of this research will feed into the first edition of the EU Diaspora Global Forum that will take place somewhere in autumn, either virtually or physically, depending on the evolution of the situation. So let's see, because indeed it is our commitment to discussing, debating the issues that you have raised today during that forum between the European Union and the diaspora organizations scattered all over Europe, and of course governments. We have also wonderful news to share. We will be launching very, very soon our capacity development component, and we encourage both governments and diaspora organizations to partner with us. On one hand, we would like to empower diaspora organizations to equip themselves with better tools to influence politics back home, but at the same time, we would like to work more closely with governments to enhance their capacities to engage and implement more meaningful enabling environments and engagement policies. We will also initiate very, very soon the Diaspora Express Mobilization Scheme, according to which we will be deploying representatives of the diaspora back home or back in their regions to contribute to development projects. And definitely we look forward to engaging with all of you. As of now, you know now who we are, what we do. As I said before, you can connect with us via our webpage, via our social media accounts, or also directly through our email. Please stay tuned, stay connected with us. And at the end, let me thank all those who have been contributing greatly to the research exercise. First of all, definitely the researchers from different countries, but also the team, Aurélie, Fanny, Charlotte, Alex, Augustine, and Andrea and Alex for having supported the researchers and for having conceptualized the idea of this research. I would like to thank all of you for attending this event. A big thank you to the interpreters who facilitated the communication, and to our IT support colleagues for having ensured that from a technical point of view, this event run smoothly and nicely. So thank you very much. Let's stay connected, and let's do more diasporization and transnationalism. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.